and welcome to this special episode of Cross-Examination, recorded in the middle of the general election campaign in mid-June 2024. The timing of the Prime Minister's announcement of the election last month took many people by surprise, but the conduct of parties, candidates and others may be turning out to be rather more predictable. The familiar accusation that the other party is lying has already been made with force. Questions of misinformation or disinformation abound, and interest has been reinvigorated in the question, what can be done to challenge breaches of the rules? In this special episode, we'll try to answer head-on questions from members of the public that we've got about the law surrounding these and other issues. And to do so, I have, as always, two of the great experts in the area. James Roochove is a solicitor and a director at Astraea Linskills, a law firm. He's a recognised expert in election law, having represented countless MPs and other office holders over the years. Hi, James.
Hello, Tom.
Suhan Rajkumar is a senior lawyer at Bateswells, specialising in campaigning and election law. He represents the full range of political parties, candidates, charities and other campaigners. Suhan, hi.
Hi, Tom.
And welcome to you both. James, let's dive straight in with the first question. The first question's from Raoul. He says, in the ITV leaders debate, Rishi Sunak claimed that, quotes, independent Treasury officials had calculated that Labour would raise taxes by £2,000 for the average household, and Labour then accused him of lying. He says, can politicians lie about their opponents in general elections, and what mechanisms does the law have to protect?
Thank you, Raoul, for your question. The main bit of legislation that you want to look at is the Representation of the People Act 1983. That sets out what legal practices are, and going to your specific question, in terms of false statements, there's provisions in there under Section 106 of the Act that deal with false statements about the personal character and conduct of a candidate.
Yep.
But I think the difference here is Raoul has mentioned about the tit-for-tat stuff going on in leaders' debates and politicians making promises or calling other people liars. That's all very much political speech. So we're looking at, in the Act, things to do with the personal character of a candidate.
Yeah.
And so that might be in terms of their personal life or things to do with those sort of areas, rather than you promised to do this, oh my gosh, you must be a liar or whatever. So there's nothing legislating against sort of political lies, so to speak.
What about Labour or anybody else? Think of many, many different examples. A candidate calling another candidate, or somebody calling another person in connection with an election, a liar. Can that ever be an illegal practice?
I think it probably depends what they're talking about, but it's probably unlikely because it's likely to be in that sort of political context. There is limited case law about this, but it is tricky to get there on Section 106. The difficulty is that it's both something you can go and get injunctions on, so it's quite novel in that respect.
Yeah.
In defamation, for example, you can't generally go and get any injunctions. There's an old case called Bonnard and Perryman that sort of sets out that you publish and be damned,
Yep.
And you don't want to then constrain free speech. But here you've got this little carve-out for people who have the bravery, I think, to go and stand for election. And well done for everyone who has put themselves forward for this one. I think it's a record number. But they get this added protection where you can actually go to the court for an injunction. But then you have to go and see what the courts think about what is personal and what is political. And that can be difficult.
So it has really to be a very clear case. I mean, I suppose to take a theoretical example, I'm sure, you say about another candidate they're a murderer. They're demonstrably not a murderer. That's going to be about their character, presumably. Or
that's a good one, yes.
Rather than their political.
I'll take that one.
Maybe difficult to think of many other very clear examples, but that would be an example of where, unless you had reasonable grounds to believe they were a murderer, I suppose, because that's a defence, you might be the wrong side of the line. Somebody can go off, he's accusing me of being a murderer during the election campaign, and go off and get Suhan an injunction, which is a form, let's just explain that a little bit more. That's a form of going to the court, which you can do during an election campaign.
Exactly.
To try and stop somebody from repeating the thing they've been saying about you, for example.
Exactly. And as James says, for defamation, that's not available if someone's going to rely on a defence of
Right.
truth. Whereas in the context of elections, you can, if you want to, go to the court and try to seek an injunction to stop someone making that claim.
Because that's quite interesting that many of the things we talk about today we might see examples of the court being quite defensive of the ability of people to say things during an election campaign because it's in the political sphere. That's, as it were, over there. We, the courts, are performing a different role. We don't really get involved in politics unless somebody drags us kicking and screaming to do so. But here you do actually have quite an interesting little potential exception to that. In the general law of defamation, you can't go off and get that on an interim basis, but you can in this context.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's exactly right that the courts are really reluctant to step into that political sphere. And that example of calling someone a liar is a really good one. That might very much sound like an accusation about someone's personal conduct and character. If someone is a liar, that speaks to how they are as a person. But if they're lying, or the accusation is they're lying about something political, the courts would treat that as a political accusation.
Another example people might have in their minds is, to which there's no clear answer and it will depend, no doubt, is racist, calling somebody racist. Think about immigration policies, the prominence that immigration debates have here. In principle, calling somebody a racist might be, in particular circumstances, the wrong side of the line. Is that right? But actually, in reality, there's going to be a backstory to why that person has used the term racist or accused them of saying a racist thing, which is likely to mean that the court will be slow to find that there was an illegal practice, James.
Yes, I think it's a lot will come down to the context. But again, I think that would be a very sort of thorny issue to delve into, because it would be linked with, no doubt, lots of political aspects of whatever party platform someone is under, and people's perceptions of that. So, yeah, I think it shows the difficulty of how you get through the political to get to the personal. And I think going further on, part of this, I think, is inspired by people writing things on the sides of buses, which seems to be the catalyst for a lot of anger. And again, even with that, some people will say what was written on the side of that bus was complete cloud cuckoo land. Others will say, oh, well, if you look at the calculations, whether it's gross or net or all these sorts of things, and this much money's been spent. So you get into huge arguments. And I think that's something that the courts don't really want to be wading into, to then go and say, you're a liar and retract that, stop doing this, damages for whatever. Very difficult to see how you start to unpick it.
Let me pick on one other thing in connection with this. There's also something, let's explain, called an election petition, which is a kind of fundamental running feature throughout this area of law, but which would kicks in many different circumstances we don't need to explain, but would be relevant to this type of illegal practice when it's alleged. So somebody after the poll result can go along to a special court, as it were, looks like a normal court, but it has special rules and procedures applying, and say that because there was illegal practice in the form of a false statement about, for example, a candidate, the entire election result in that particular constituency should be voided, without having to demonstrate, as you often have to do in that type of case, that it would have affected the result. Another candidate would have won. Should we just explain, Suhan, the nature of an election petition?
Yeah, of course. And this is another area where this law is quite different to defamation and adds a lot to the specific election context, because you might otherwise think, well, if you're making a false statement about someone's personal conduct or character, isn't that just defamation? Don't we already have law that deals with that? But in defamation, you can't get an injunction as you can under this, and you also can't bring an election petition and unwind the result of the election. And it's pretty rare, I think, in this context for false statements, as we've said, because the court is really reluctant to engage in that political discourse. But probably the key case is from 2010, where an election result was unwound, where it was found that a Labour candidate who was eventually elected had made false statements about a Lib Dem candidate's personal conduct or character. And so some of the kind of statements that were found to have been a false statement of conduct or character in that case were very much personal. They were about whether the candidate had disclaimed threats of personal violence, whether they'd made other certain very personal statements. But I think quite interesting is one area which the courts eventually found wasn't a false statement about personal conduct or character, was a claim about whether the candidate would live in the area once they were elected. And the courts found that was actually political, because it was about the connection the candidate had to the local area.
Yes.
And again, that feels like you might think it's personal because it's about where someone's going to live, but actually the court decided that was political. So there was really quite a lot of latitude, I think, in this kind of political debate.
I mean, the judge is going to, it seems to me, quite often be mindful of the end game here, particularly in this type of case where the allegation can be made if there's been the illegal practice, the entire thing is voided. You don't need to get into the complicated business of working out what would have happened had the thing not occurred, as judges often have to do under the law of causation in other areas. The judge is thinking it's a binary choice. Either the election is voided and the other person wins, or we start again, or nothing. And there'll be a reluctance instinctively, I would have thought, on the part of many judges to say, crikey, I'm not wanting, unless clearly persuaded, to arrive at an end result here, which means that the election has to be brought to nothing. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair.
That's saying things about other candidates. What about the promises you make in an election campaign? Things, if you like, that you say about yourself, or what you're going to do if you're elected in office, typically in a manifesto. We've got a question actually on that from Siobhan. She says, I think the Tory pledge about national service for 18-year-olds is a good policy, but I don't think the Tories would actually enact it if they win. If they did win, could the law do anything to make them stick to their promise? And I'm not sure, James, that would be a particularly promising type of claim.
It would not, no. I think you'd have real problems if we've got a judiciary that starts, even with election petitions, thinking, I'm not sure I want a medal here, to then have the courts involved in mandatory injunctions to force you to bring in national service or whatever Siobhan might have liked, which didn't quite come to fruition, I think would be riddled with problems. And there's case law where various councils haven't fulfilled manifesto commitments and things like that. But it's something where the ultimate judge in all of this is the electorate. If I make crazy promises and I get elected and then I don't fulfill them, then they can boot me out again. I think, again, if you had legislation or courts dealing with that, it would start to sort of taint the whole atmosphere of an election campaign. I worry, for example, for Count Binface. I haven't looked at his manifesto in huge detail, but if he won, and sometimes these sort of joke candidates, they do actually win. In Hartlepool, when they first had a mayor for Hartlepool, the local football mascot, Hengus the monkey, he won, but then immediately took off his monkey costume and started doing a sort of proper job of being the mayor, but he wasn't elected on that. So, it's a silly example, but the idea then that having people being able to go to the courts and force manifesto commitments through, not least, they might be impractical. And there's all sorts of reasons why things don't happen. We hear it endlessly in debates and all the rest of it that we're getting at the moment as to people's record. But the ultimate judge and jury here are the people who can then go and vote for who they want.
I think it goes back to the false statement question, because part of political debate is saying part of the remedy is voters at the ballot box, but part of the remedy is just political debate. A candidate being able to say, actually, that promise from the Conservatives or from Labour is ludicrous. They're never going to be able to do that, and it's an important part of the political debate. If you just had promises that could be implemented, which are quite difficult to achieve in itself, that would remove, I think, a lot of space from that debate.
I mean, I suppose one final qualification from me in answer to Siobhan would be that in public law, there is this distinction drawn between when people complain about a failure to comply with a manifesto promise once the candidate has got in, which by itself is out, you can't challenge, and a slightly different, subtly but importantly different situation where somebody comes into office and then say, I'm going to do the thing that was in my manifesto, which is not an uncommon scenario, even if they don't in fact then go on and do that very thing. There might then be a slightly more promising basis, although I say only slightly in public law, to say you're in breach of what's called a legitimate expectation. So a clear statement by the office holder that they're going to do something to which the court will hold them to unless there's some good reason why they shouldn't be. But even in those situations, it's relatively difficult, I think, for a claimant to establish the court should stick to it. All right, it's a separate question now from someone confusingly also called James.
Great name.
Which is about the potential power of social media. I'm not sure there's much potential about it. The potential power of social media to influence, says James, election results is obvious. What laws, he says, regulate social media in the context of elections? There's an awful lot to potentially unpick there. One thing, James, which strikes me as a helpful starting point is what more recent legislation during the term of this government has done in relation to one corner of this, which is essentially advertising by candidates or parties. Has the law caught up with that? What does it now say?
Well, the Elections Act 2022 brings in, so when you had leaflets, we still do, but leaflets in your periodicals, you would have the small print, which basically tells you who it's being printed and promoted on behalf of. And that effectively goes back to giving you recourse that if there's something libelous or false statement, you've got a way of tracking down who has done it. So all of the different candidates will make sure they put that, and they've legally got to put that on their material. And the 2022 Act meant that they had to put it on their digital material as well, which is all well and good. And same for third-party campaigners and lots of people. I think the difficulty with it is that you're almost preaching to the converted a little, because all the people who would probably comply with imprints and the rules generally are going to comply to with this. There might be an odd exception. Yeah. The real problem is these kind of rogue videos or deep fakes that are now starting to get pumped out, and you've got to then unpick who's actually published them and see what's going on there. So it's the legislation is useful to a degree, but we've already seen this election campaign sort of fake videos of Wes Streeting going around, doctored audio to make it sound like he's being offensive when he hasn't been. And that goes on X or other platforms, and it proliferates all over the place, and you're playing catch up then, trying to sort of claw back and show people that it's false. That's a real problem. There's been cases, again, lots of these social media giants have political ad libraries, and you can have a record of who's put the ads out, but sometimes it doesn't always work. And so the real terrible situation could be if you've got not only posts that go viral just because they're being pumped out by bots or whatever else, but if you're also paying to use the platforms to pump them out, and they've got false information or anything like that, that is a real worry. So I think there's a lot more that needs to be done in the coming years.
Right, so you might have a situation where somebody who's bound by the legislation, most obviously a party or a candidate, finds themselves in a situation where, because of the technology that's being used, somebody can accuse them, and they're, as it were, innocently proceeding on the basis that they think they're complying. But actually the situation is that as a result of the technology that's being used, the relevant imprints aren't going on to make clear who it's coming from. That could be a scenario?
Possibly, yes. Or I suppose it's not beyond the wit of man to actually put someone else's imprint on something they haven't actually promoted. So they could then be carrying the can for that and have to show that they haven't done it. But I think it's these kind of rogue actors that, whether it's a surrogate of a particular campaign or just someone with an axe to grind, if you put it out there anonymous, you can unpick these things, but it takes quite a lot of time, quite a lot of money potentially, and we're in a very fast-paced situation in an election campaign where the damage is being done, and the difficulty of trying to row back from that before polling day, it's a huge challenge.
And I suppose, I mean, you describe there the possibility of a surrogate kind of actor. In principle, also somebody who is nothing to do, on any view, nothing to do with a political party or a candidate, but is powerful on social media, is an influencer. If the influencer, for example, take the case of a classic known, established, self-identifying influencer, if they're doing it by or on behalf of a political party, they will be caught by the legislation. If the political party, for example, is paying for them to, which can happen, does happen, for influencers to go out and spread the message, the influencer will be caught as well as the party. So you've got, at least in theory, the ability to identify the source. It's not actually the influencer, as it were, it's actually the message of the party, and it's being paid for. But somebody who's an influencer might be very powerful but isn't doing so on behalf of the party, and it might not be clear whether or not they are, won't be caught prima facie by the legislation. Is that right?
I think, again, it will be the context of what they're doing. If a famous person or an influencer wants to go and express their views on who you should and shouldn't vote for at an election, that's their freedom of speech, and they can say what they like within reason. So, yes, I think it's, as with everything in law, it can all get very complicated and costly, which is a shame, because it would be nice, especially with this sort of stuff, that if you could act quickly, because if I was a candidate and I had a doctored video or audio of me that was going around causing huge damage to my reputation, that's not going to encourage people to get involved in politics.
Where these imprints, where you are required, Suhan, to put these imprints on digital material, what do they have to say? What's the limit of?
Yeah, so I mean, they're helpful, but they're pretty limited. You have to say who it's promoted on behalf of and a postal address for that person or that organisation. But there are huge gaps, as James has said, with that legislation. So take that example you were talking about of a doctored video of a candidate. If someone has paid for that material to go out, so a paid for Facebook ad or something, they have to put the imprint on. If someone is has a registered status with the Electoral Commission, they have to put the imprint on, even if they haven't paid for it.
Yep.
But if it's just an influencer who's not paying for it and just doing it organically, there's no need for an imprint. And then even if people do comply and put the imprints on, it's somewhat helpful to know who's done it. But if it's still not illegal to do that video of Wes Streeting saying something awful, and it just says promoted on behalf of Suhan Rajkumar, my address, it doesn't really achieve that much. Is it still problematic in terms of the election? Probably yes. Is there any recourse? Probably not, unless it's defamatory or a false statement as to someone's conduct or character.
All right, next question. Question from Fatima, which I think is really about spending limits and also the question of funding, the related question of funding, including donations to parties and candidates. She says the Labour website, which she's been on, currently says, quotes, Labour has the plan, but the Tories have the funds. We can't match the Tories pound for pound in this election campaign without your help, and invites people to donate. She says, what are the spending and funding rules that apply for parties and candidates at general elections? And are the same rules applied to all?
Broadly, parties are allowed to spend £54,000 or thereabouts per constituency they're standing someone in. And then candidates have an additional limit that they can spend. And that's increased hugely just in the last year. If a party is standing a candidate in every seat in Great Britain, then they can spend, I think it's around 34 million, and that used to be 19 million. So there's a huge increase there.
What about if you breach them? What's the position?
Good question. So I think it's probably fair to say that it's not uncommon to see breaches, and the Electoral Commission has the power to issue fines, the Electoral Commission, the regulator of elections. But those fines are capped at £20,000. They can be stacked if the Commission finds kind of a number of different technical breaches. But, if you have a budget of 34 million, you might see a couple of fines here or there as almost a cost of doing business. I think it's not a very significant fine. And the Electoral Commission has asked for additional powers, but hasn't been given them by Parliament.
Parliament hasn't given power to political parties to have more spending than they previously had the power to incur, but the regulator, the Electoral Commission, which will come on to, the power to punish political parties, may not raise too many eyebrows. James,
well, to be fair, I think we leave out the police who actually do look into it. Yeah. And going back to the spending and the punishments involved if you overspend, like you could go to prison. Mm-hmm. So I don't have massive sympathy for the limits of the Electoral Commission's powers at this stage, because you've got the very large stick to beat people with the police on the other side of things.
The law's changed on this now to a material extent. Tell us about the experience of one of your clients, Craig McKinley, who famously and celebratedly returned to Parliament just before Parliament was dissolved for the general election only a few weeks ago. He was your client when he got involved in the issues around whether or not something was properly party spending or candidate spending in the 2015 election. What happened there?
Yeah, Craig stood for Parliament in 2015 in South Thanet in Kent. And he found that his opponent was Nigel Farage. He's obviously back in the news now.
Yep.
And again, that was the Nigel Farage in his pomp, having won the European elections the year before. So there was a really big battle that went on. And going back to our election laws, they're basically underpinned by Victorian legislation. And that's kind of been added to over the years. But more and more, the local political parties, the associations or the local groups, they used to be really powerful and well populated. So a Conservative association would often have sort of thousands of members in certain parts of the country, a real sort of community hub almost. Whereas nowadays, whether it's Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem, you're going to have a handful of politicos, I think, who get involved locally. So a lot more emphasis is on the central parties, and that's happened for decades now. And so the central parties, they have their spending, and that's dealt with the Electoral Commission more and in different legislation. And then you've got the individual candidates who have their spending. So as we've touched on before, the difficulty is how do you categorise what a piece of spending is? Is it for the candidate? Is it for the party? And this situation in South Thanet was very unique because, again, looking at our Victorian legislation, we usually have two big parties, whether it was the Liberals and the Tories, or later on Labour replacing them, the Liberals, and them going up against the Conservatives. More insurgents like UKIP, Nigel Farage, that challenges the system because you've got a candidate who's got a massive profile and is a party leader, is a national figure, is going around during that election and probably during this election, going to multiple constituencies in the same way that a Rishi Sunak or a Keir Starmer will. But Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, they will have, at least on paper, what seems to be a safe seat. So a seat where they're very likely, as long as they put the blue or red rosette on, and they'll get huge numbers of votes. For someone like Nigel Farage, he doesn't have that sort of that structure built up yet, where he's got an obvious place where he can just go and have an election campaign, but not necessarily a massive fight to win election, which allows you to then go around the country. So what do you do in South Thanet? You want to stop Nigel Farage, potentially, because he's quite a big figure and he makes a lot of noise and he attracts lots of Conservative votes, potentially. So you put quite a lot of resource into it. But is that resource your candidates or is it your parties? And so we spent many years and a trip to the Supreme Court, and then a 3-month trial at Suffolk Crown Court, and there's more clarification now. Again, looking back, the role of the election agent. So every candidate has to have an election agent. That's a legal position. And so it used to be that the agent was this all-powerful figure, the gatekeeper of the campaign. They would run the budget. They'd be responsible for all the spending of the candidate. They'd hold all the money. And again, that's still the case, but it's been eroded a bit by the fact that then a party can go and spend a lot of money and it might impact upon that particular constituency. So it's more difficult. So we've had this complex sort of weaving in and out to then get to the point where it's now legislated, say that the agent does have that sort of power to be able to say yes or no and can't have things spent that should go towards a spending limit without them even knowing what's going on.
So an example might be the party supplies a bus or transport in a local constituency and gives or seeks to give heavy resource to that because it's particularly worried for the sort of reasons that you explain about how the vote might go in that constituency. The party wants to pump more money into a particular constituency, so does more stuff than it might do in other constituencies. And the question was, at least in the McKinley case, kind of at the heart of it, is use of a facility like that, or another example might be a leaflet produced by the party. Is that the candidate's expenditure or is it the party's expenditure? And that's now been clarified, however, in the Elections Act 2022 that you mentioned.
It has been clarified to an extent. I think it's still difficult to work out exactly how you should deal with it. I don't think anyone has the definitive answer. Again, if I have a leaflet that has a bit of Rishi Sunak on and then a bit of the local candidate, do you split it, or is it just that it's going out in that area? If you have a visit, what percentage of the time is it about the local rather than the national? You could really go down some rabbit holes on it.
What about those donations? The question's asking, is implying that Labour are saying we need more money than the Tories. Is that because in the war chest overall of the Labour Party, they're not going to get up to the spending limit and somebody else is? I mean, if you've got enough money to get up to the spending limit, you can't spend any more than the spending limit. So is funding, in other words, is seeking donations, which both of the main parties do and others, as they're doing at the moment, is that something that goes towards an amount that is ultimately capped, or is it being used for some other purpose?
No, so there's no cap on the amount of donations you can receive. There are limits that you have to check that a donor is permissible, so basically based in the UK, and that only accounts for donations above £500. So you can have smaller donations from anyone because they're not donations in law. But you can raise more than the spending limits and spend it on things which don't technically fall within the rules, or keep it for the next election.
I see.
There's no limit on how much you can raise.
I mean, that might interest people, because people might think, well, if I'm giving money, whether it's a tenner or 100 quid or £1,000,000, I'm giving it for the purpose of spending on this election. Thank you very much. But what you're saying is actually there's certainly not an obligation on the party.
Well, I suppose there's at least a degree of flexibility.
Yeah.
If you have £5 million that you're planning to spend on the election, and then you then say to your members, we desperately need £5 million spent on the election, you could just keep that other 5 million you already had and spend it on something else. So there's kind of quite a lot of flexibility. I think that there is obviously a matter of the trust of your donors, whether you want to act in that way. And you also have to report on donations you receive every week in the kind of couple of weeks before the election. So there's quite a lot of visibility on how much money you've raised.
And briefly, James, on donations, I can find out as an interested member of the public through going on the Electoral Commission's website registers of donors, but in certain circumstances. Just briefly explain that.
Yes, it's a great question, actually, from Fatima, because it links in with the lying, as you've already said.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of those things where there are elements of a campaign which don't get picked up by the limits. So, like staffing costs, for example, that is out of it. So Labour here might be thinking that they're going to go and spend loads of money on extra staff.
Yeah.
And we'll never know about that because it won't be in their return.
Yeah.
But you can find out about the donations. It's only donations over a certain level that will be declared to find out who the big ones have come from.
This is staff for the purposes of running the campaign.
Well, that's part of the whole process of them being there, isn't it?
Right.
So, yes, I think there are elements of it which then don't get included in your spending limit. So it's quite a complicated picture.
There are, as it were, there's types of expenditure which might be quite fundamental expenditure if it's the cost of staff, which simply doesn't have to be declared. I wonder, I mean, that might raise the eyebrows of some members of the public, because it's effectively a no-go area without any control, or even oversight by the Electoral Commission, because they'd have no business in saying, why isn't this in your return, if you don't have to declare that particular form of expenditure.
So again, you've got the difference between your national and your local returns. So the local return will have to put in, if you've got like a paid agent or other paid staff, but if they're for the national party, then it doesn't get picked up. So it's these kind of things that are difficult.
And there are some limits on that as well. So it's illegal to pay someone to canvass. So it's not like a party could recruit a whole army of canvassers to go and knock on doors, and that would sneak through the limits, because you can't do that anyway. So it is a bit of a gap, and I think highlights the fact that our election law is pretty fragile and kind of this kind of Jenga tower built on Victorian law. And that's just kind of where we are now, is that staff costs for parties aren't included.
Let me come back to the question of policing or enforcing the sort of rules that we've been talking about today when it comes to conduct, what you can say or how much you can spend or money that you can receive. Broadly speaking, you've got, in some circumstances, the possibility to go to court, as explained earlier, to get an injunction. You have this unusual bespoke procedure called an election petition. And there's this body, the Electoral Commission, that we've mentioned, that's the regulator that has various responsibilities. Starting with you, Suhan, can I ask for your sense on how effective overall those mechanisms taken as a whole, courts over here and regulator over there, perhaps, how effective are they to make sure that the laws are actually being observed here, that compliance is taking place to a large or complete extent? Is there a better way of doing it? Is change debated by those who practice in this area?
Big question. I think the Electoral Commission has wanted more powers for a while to regulate. It doesn't want to kind of step into the roles of the police, which has its own role, and I think certainly the Electoral Commission would be very nervous about that. But I think a bigger question is whether the laws themselves are sufficient. The laws that the Electoral Commission and the police are regulating on are sufficient. So we've talked about whether it's okay to lie, whether it's okay to publish a deep fake. I think the enforcement regime is fine, but whether the actual law has kept up with our technology and the state of our political debate is a different question.
How much incentive is there for Parliament to change these laws, James, given that any government, let's assume for a moment a majority government, and therefore a government able to pass the legislation in question, any government wishing to change it will know that it'll apply both to the opposition and to them in future, unless some future majority government comes along and changes it again. How realistic is it to expect parliaments acting through, in practice, majority governments to get to grips with some of the difficulties that with the enforceability of these laws that seems to be quite marked?
I think it's highly unlikely that anything will happen. I think our sort of patchwork quilt of legislation kind of works, and I think that politicians are relatively satisfied and they know what is going on. Obviously, the Electoral Commission, I think, would like more powers. Again, I've had experience with various police forces in relation to election offences. Some take them more seriously than others. I have a firm that is one of a dwindling number that actually deals with legal aid criminal work. I appreciate that the police are dealing with some pretty heavy stuff most of the time. This is obviously very important, but who spent what on a bus sometimes doesn't necessarily get the juices flowing of the police. I would also say, in terms of the Electoral Commission, they're not always the most consistent with their guidance and advice, and they've had court battles that they've lost where they've taken action and that's been overturned. Case with Darren Grimes during the referendum.
Yep.
So it's not as if it's sort of a perfect alternative to have them take over and have more powers.
I mean, all regulators soon have their own cultures. I mean, it strikes me as quite interesting that this particular regulator is publicly saying it should have more powers. Not all regulators do that. Many of them regard their role as being thoroughly neutral. We simply do the thing that the law tells us. We act within the powers that the law gives us. This particular regulator is saying, actually, help us out, please. We're struggling without the ability to take action, to enforce, to keep people to some of the standards that the law imposes.
Yeah, I mean, they have a big remit to uphold democracy and uphold the kind of integrity of elections, so you can understand that they take that very seriously. I think the other thing to think about in terms of reform of the law is the increase in which we're seeing people use the law as a political weapon. And so there's always a risk that if you make more electoral conduct illegal, you'll see more media stories about where Angela Rayner lived or how much was spent on a bus. And so I think there could well be a real nervousness in kind of among political parties and candidates to give people more hooks that then almost become to an extent, an important part of the debate, but also somewhat of a distraction, I think.
Well, perish the thought, of course, that anybody would use the law for a political purpose. James, quick prediction for the election result?
I think that it's going to be a challenging time for whoever has the honour to serve our country, and I wish them well.
I could tell that I wasn't going to get a straight answer. Am I going to get a straight answer from Suhan?
I mean,
no.
Anything can change. A few weeks ago, who knows what
do you think, Tom?
All right, well, we've run out of time.
What's your prediction, Tom?
We've run out
of
time
Tom?
Exactly at this point. In all seriousness, though, thank you very much indeed, Suhan Rajkumar and James Roochove. Thank you for cross-examining with me today.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Well, we've reached the end of the podcast, but we'll be back soon and we'd love to know what you'd like us to examine next. Tell us what you're interested in or concerned about in the world of law by tweeting at CrossExaminePod or by visiting our website. That's www.crossexamination.co.uk. Remember to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you've got time, we'd love a positive review on Apple Podcasts. It's the best way to spread the word about cross-examination. Meanwhile, I've been Tom Cross, and until next time, goodbye.